The dust clung like a shroud, coating everything in a uniform, weary brown. The sun beat down with a malice that bleached the sky and cracked the earth, a relentless, silent enemy in a land that gave nothing freely. He had seen many things in this desolate expanse: the bleached bones of cattle, the skeletal remains of abandoned dreams, the gaunt faces of folks clinging to the edge of survival. But he hadn't expected this. Huddled beneath the meager shade of an ancient, wind-blasted rock formation was a figure, small, still utterly exposed. As he drew closer, his boot crunching on loose shale, the details sharpened into a tableau of raw, visceral pain. It was a girl, barely more than a woman, perhaps 21 years by the look of her worn frame, but the vulnerability etched into her posture made her seem younger, fragile as spun glass. Her head was shaved, the scalp a pale, vulnerable curve exposed to the harsh light. It wasn't a clean cut, but jagged and uneven, the kind of hurried, cruel shearing that spoke of contempt, not style. And on that exposed skin, scrawled in thick, black charcoal, were words. Simple, brutal, indelible in their intent. Unwanted. The letters were stark against her pale skin, a brand applied with malice. She didn't stir as he approached, her gaze fixed on the dust at her feet, her shoulders slumped, embodying utter defeat. Her dress was simple, faded cotton, torn at the hem, offering no protection against the grit that settled on her skin like a second coat. There was no luggage, no pack, nothing to suggest a journey, only abandonment. The air around her felt heavy, thick with the weight of despair. It was a palpable thing, pressing down, threatening to suffocate. He stopped a dozen yards away, his own worn leather creaking slightly. He was a man of few words, his face weathered into a landscape as harsh as the one around them. But even he felt the icy tendrils of her aloneness reach out. The silence stretched, broken only by the relentless buzz of flies and the mournful sigh of the wind. He didn't speak, sensing that any sound might shatter the fragile shell she inhabited. He merely watched, assessing. Not with judgment, but with the quiet, observant neutrality of one who had also known the sharp edges of the world. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. A tremor ran through her frame, not from cold, but from a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went soul-deep. The sun glinted off the charcoal, making the words seem to shimmer with cruel emphasis. Unwanted. A label, a sentence, etched onto her very being. He carried water, a little food, the basic necessities for survival in this unforgiving place. They felt inadequate now, offerings against a wound that seemed to be entirely internal, a branding far deeper than skin. The silence held, a thick, uncomfortable cloak. He knew he couldn't just leave her. Not like this. Not branded and broken beneath the indifferent sky. The decision, unspoken and unbidden, settled in the space between them. He took a slow step forward. He remained at a careful distance, settling onto a rock worn smooth by millennia of wind and sand. He unslung the canvas bag from his shoulder, moving slowly, deliberately, ensuring his actions were plain and held no threat. From the bag, he took out a dented metal canteen and unscrewed the cap. The slosh of water within was loud in the silence. He didn't offer it directly, didn't approach her space. Instead, he placed it gently on the ground between them, perhaps 5 yards from her feet. Then, he took out a small, hard biscuit of dried meat and grain, setting it beside the canteen. Simple provisions. Survival rations. He didn't look at her face directly, keeping his gaze on the ground or the horizon, respecting the fragile barrier she had erected around herself. He knew the look in her eyes already, the vacant stare of someone who had seen too much, felt too deeply, and had finally reached the end of endurance. The word on her head seemed to pulse in the heat, a physical manifestation of the invisible chains that bound her. He waited. The flies continued their drone. The wind continued its lonely song. Time seemed to stretch and blur, marked only by the slow creep of the sun across the sky. Minutes bled into what felt like an hour. She hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged his presence beyond that initial, almost imperceptible tensing when he first stopped. He considered speaking, offering a quiet word, but decided against it. Words were often hollow things out here, easily swept away by the wind, easily misunderstood. Actions held more weight. Presence held more weight. He watched a lizard scurry across the hot rock near his feet, a brief flash of vibrant life against the muted landscape. Eventually, slowly, hesitantly, her head lifted. Not towards him, but just a fraction, enough to shift her gaze from the immediate dust to the middle distance. Her eyes, when they caught the light, were a startling blue, framed by the harsh, uneven stubble of her hair. They held no expression he could read, only a vast emptiness, a reflection of the desolate sky above. He didn't meet her gaze directly, but he felt the weight of it, brief and unseeing. Then, painstakingly, as if each movement was an immense effort, one hand unclasped from the other and reached out, not towards him but towards the canteen. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the cool metal. She lifted it slowly, brought it to her lips, and drank. The water trickled from the corner of her mouth, disappearing into the dry earth. It was a small act, but significant, a spark of fundamental need asserting itself over the deadening weight of despair. He remained still, a statue in the heat, his presence a quiet anchor in the swirling chaos of her apparent abandonment. She drank deeply, then lowered the canteen, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. She didn't touch the biscuit. Not yet, but the connection had been made. Not through words, but through shared space, shared silence, and the silent offering of necessity. The desert held its breath. The girl, Sarah, he later learned, didn't speak that day, nor the next. She merely followed. He had risen with the first hint of gray light and begun to walk, heading towards a distant ridge he knew might offer a trickle of water. He hadn't asked her to come. He hadn't waited. He had simply moved. After a time, he heard the faint shuffle of footsteps behind him. She kept her distance, trailing him by 20 or 30 yards, a silent shadow in the vast landscape. He didn't look back often, trusting the sound, sensing her presence like the subtle shift in wind direction. He kept the pace steady, mindful of her likely weakness. He noticed she had eventually eaten the biscuit. The canteen was empty by sunrise. He refilled it at the rocky seep he found, offering it to her silently when she reached the spot, still keeping the distance. She drank, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting second before dropping. Still no words. The charcoal mark remained, a dark, stark statement on her scalp. He didn't ask about it. He didn't ask about anything. The past was a heavy burden in this land, and some burdens were not meant to be shared, only carried. They walked for days like this, him leading, her following. They spoke through actions. He would leave water and a portion of his meager food supply for her. She would take it only after he had moved some distance away. He would choose sheltered spots for them to rest, building a small fire at night, positioning himself so he was between her and the open darkness. She would watch him with those wide, empty blue eyes, slowly, painstakingly, beginning to fill with something other than despair, observation, tentative curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of calculation. Her movements gained a little strength, the deep exhaustion slowly receding, replaced by a wary alertness. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken language of shared hardship, of mutual dependence in a place that demanded vigilance. He saw her watching his hands as he built the fire, or his gaze as he scanned the horizon. She was learning him piece by painstaking piece, just as he was learning the subtle cues of her presence, the shift in her posture, the depth of her breathing. He noticed the charcoal mark seemed slightly faded by the sun and wind, less a stark brand, more a part of the weathered landscape of her head. But it was still there, a reminder of the cruelty she had endured. He wondered about the story behind it, about who would do such a thing, but he kept the questions locked away. Some doors were best left unopened. He sensed that forcing conversation would break the fragile, unspooling thread between them. Trust out here was built not on shared stories, but on shared survival. He would provide the latter, and perhaps, eventually, the former might follow. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the scent of dust and something else, a faint, metallic tang he recognized with immediate, sharp awareness. Trouble. He stopped instantly, holding up a hand without looking back. Behind him, he heard Sarah halt, her movements now quicker, less hesitant than before. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare. 2 riders, still distant, but approaching steadily from the southeast. They rode with a casual confidence that spoke volumes, are not travelers, but men who belonged here, or took what they wanted here. His hand drifted instinctively towards the worn handle of the revolver tucked into his belt. He rarely used it, but it was a necessary weight in this world. He glanced back at Sarah. The wary alertness he had seen building in her eyes had sharpened into fear, raw and unmistakable. Her gaze wasn't on the riders, but on the mark on her head, her hand rising instinctively towards it, a gesture of remembered shame and vulnerability. He saw the connection instantly. These men, or men like them, might be the reason for the mark, the architects of her abandonment. He turned back to face the approaching riders, his body language shifting subtly, becoming still, solid, rooted. "Stay low," he said, his voice a low rumble, the first words he had spoken directly to her in days. Behind the rocks, she hesitated for a split second, her eyes wide, then scrambled quickly towards the formation they had been using for windbreak. He waited, letting the riders close the distance. They were rough-looking men, trail-worn and hard-faced, their eyes already sweeping over the landscape, missing nothing. They saw him, a lone figure in the open, and their pace slowed, dissolving the pretense of merely passing by. "Afternoon," the lead rider called out, his voice rough. "Lost." Elias didn't answer immediately. He simply stood, his hands loose at his sides, his posture neither inviting nor overtly hostile, but radiating an unnerving stillness. The second rider had flanked out slightly, his gaze sweeping past Elias, searching. He knew they were looking for something or someone, and he knew, with a cold certainty, they were looking for Sarah. "Didn't catch the name," the first rider pressed, his tone hardening. "Or what you're doing out here." Elias's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "Passing through," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of inflection. "Nothing here for you." The second rider nudged his horse closer, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe there is," he sneered. "Heard tell of someone missing. Little bird that flew the coop." His gaze flickered towards the rocks where Sarah was hidden. In that instant, Elias moved. Fast. Not towards his gun, but towards the horses. A sudden, loud shout. A stomp of his boot, his arms thrown wide. The horses, startled by the unexpected aggression from a seemingly passive man, shied violently. The riders cursed, struggling to control their mounts. It wasn't a fight. Not yet, but a disruption, a calculated chaos. It bought precious seconds. "Get going!" Elias roared over the snorting horses, not to the riders, but to Sarah. He didn't look at her, keeping his focus on the struggling men. He heard a rustle from the rocks, the sound of frantic movement. Good. She was running. The riders regained control, their faces contorted with rage. "You'll regret that," the first man snarled, reaching for a rifle in his saddle scabbard. Elias didn't wait. He turned and ran, not towards Sarah, but in a different direction, drawing their attention, leading them away from her. The crack of a rifle echoed across the plain. He didn't look back. He didn't know how long he ran, only that the sun was beginning its descent by the time the sounds of pursuit finally faded, or perhaps he had outpaced them, or they had given up the chase for one lone man when they were after other quarry. Exhausted, his lungs burning, he sank down behind a ridge, waiting, listening. Silence returned, vast and empty. He waited longer. Then, cautiously, he began to make his way back, circling wide, following his own faint tracks. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple by the time he found her. She was waiting near the rocks where he had told her to hide. Not running, not hiding further, but waiting. She had cleaned her head as best she could, rubbing at the charcoal mark with dust and the meager water left in the canteen. It was faded now, smudged, almost illegible, but still visible. When he approached, she didn't flinch. Her eyes, in the twilight, were still wide, but the fear had receded, replaced by something quiet and resolute. She looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. He saw understanding there, and a depth of resilience he hadn't fully appreciated. The unwanted mark, faded and blurred, no longer seemed to define her. It was a scar, yes, a testament to cruelty, but it wasn't the whole story. She was still standing, still here, still fighting in her own way. She had waited for him. It was a small act, but out here, in this land of abandonment, it was monumental. He sat down heavily beside her, the silence comfortable now, shared not just in hardship, but in a quiet victory. He didn't ask about the men or the mark or the story behind it all. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she had endured, that she had waited, that she had chosen to trust. In this land that stripped away everything but the barest essence of a person, she had found a core of strength she perhaps hadn't known she possessed. The world had tried to mark her, to cast her aside, but she had refused to be defined by the cruelty of others. She was not unwanted, she was simply Sarah, standing in the fading light, a survivor. He looked at her, then out at the stars beginning to prick the bruised sky. They had a long road ahead, but they would walk it together, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two souls who had found a flicker of connection in the vast, indifferent dark. Her transformation wasn't complete, perhaps it never would be in a place like this, but the journey from branded vulnerability to quiet resilience had begun. And in the shared silence beneath the immense, indifferent sky that felt like everything,